Welcome, everyone. Welcome to Sitheads Meditation Club. My name is John. I organize this group. Sitheads is a sitting and social group for people interested in deep meditation practice. Everything we do is free and donation-based. If you want to hang out with us, you can find us at sit-heads.com. We do not have any one set teacher here at Sitheads, but we do have visiting teachers and other guests join us from time to time, like our wonderful guest today, Dr. Judson Brewer, MD, PhD, is a psychiatrist, a neuroscientist, a best-selling author. He is one of the leading and most prominent meditation and mindfulness researchers. He studies the neural mechanisms of mindfulness using standard and real-time fMRI. He has taken what he's learned and created very successful programs, including some online app-based programs for treating cravings and addiction, and also for managing anxiety. So you can check those out. He has apps. I believe they are called Unwinding Anxiety for anxiety, Craving to Quit for addictions, and Eat Right Now, I think would be the way to say that, not Eat Right Now, for overeating. Judd is also the Director of Research and Innovation at the Mindfulness Center and Associate Professor in Behavioral and Social Sciences at the School of Public Health and Psychiatry at the School of Medicine at my alma mater, Brown University. And he's also the Executive Medical Director of Behavioral Health at ShareCare, as well as a research affiliate at MIT. The man has a lot going on. Judd is also a very serious meditator with extensive retreat experience. Judd, I'm so glad that you are here with us. Welcome. Is there anything that you'd like to say before we have our little conversation and then open up the Q&A?
Let's jump right in.
All right, great. So what we're going to do is you and I'll chat for maybe, 25 minutes, something like that, 25, 30, whatever. And then we'll open it up to Q&A from the group, and we'll do that for about an hour. So, one thing I'm really curious about is you are a serious meditator, right? And you and I have spoken, and I know that you're a practitioner. You don't just practice for a little bit of stress relief or a little bit of calm, as completely wonderful and valid a motivation as that is. You are walking a contemplative path for self-transformation and so forth. Given that, and given that you are an expert in things like habit change, do you have suggestions for those of us who are trying to practice for transformation or practice for awakening and walk that more traditional contemplative path? That's hard to do in a busy world, with a busy life for lay people. And do you have suggestions, or is there anything that you've learned or anything that your research has told you in terms of habit change for how we can implement more effective habits specifically for that sort of deep meditation practice?
Yeah, so we can take this any direction that would be helpful for the group.
Yeah.
So what I would say is, when I started meditating, beginning medical school, and probably about 8 years into practice, when I was in residency, I started to notice that my patients were using the same language that the Buddha was using: craving, clinging. And the treatments that we have for addictions are not, let's just say they're not as good as we'd all like them to be, not very good. And so I started exploring, why are my patients using the same language as, the Buddhist psychology when they don't, they don't have, they're not practicing Buddhist, for example. And I started to see that there was actually a lot to, basically this concept of dependent origination, something that I'd struggled with myself as a concept, was something that my patients were kind of playing out in their daily lives in terms of being caught in the cycle of samsara.
And do you mind, Judd, I'm sorry, do you mind briefly giving like a very short capsule explanation or definition of dependent origination for people who aren't familiar with what that is or practice in a different tradition?
Sure. Well, I just,
Hard to give a capsule definition.
yeah, I
of
was
that
going to say, I myself very much struggle with it. So what I'll say is that in the modern day psychologists were actually describing the same thing that the ancient Buddhists were describing. And, my understanding is, I'm not a Buddhist scholar, but my understanding is that, the Buddha was contemplating dependent origination on the night of his enlightenment. So he had done all of these practices, he'd found the middle path because both extremes didn't work for him. And even deep absorptive meditation didn't get him enlightened. It was his seeing clearly these causal links that cause suffering. So, generally speaking, in Theravada Buddhism, they talk about dependent origination in terms of having 12 links. Often that's talked about as a web of interconnectedness. But basically, the idea is cause and effect. This is where, karma comes in. This is where rebirth comes in. And the idea is that, there are these conditions that leads to pleasant and unpleasant, so for example, if I see a piece of cake, I might have, based on my previous conditioning, based on whether I've eaten cake in the past or not, it might look pleasant to me. Versus if last time I ate that kind of cake, I got food poisoning, it elicits some type of an unpleasant reaction through what are described as my sense stores, basically. And so this pleasant and unpleasant leads to a craving or aversion, depending on what my conditioning is. And then if there's something that I'm craving, I want more of it. If there's something I'm averse to, I push it away. And so basically these links basically lay out this idea of that, how we form habits, and the Buddha described the habit of self. There's this birth that comes. So basically goes, something is pleasant or unpleasant or neutral that leads to a craving or an aversion, which then leads to us, depending on how you translate the word upadana, it either is a clinging, it can be translated as clinging, or it can also be translated as fuel for the fire of craving. And then they talk about, you do something and this leads to the birth of a sense of a self, like, oh, chocolate cake, I eat some chocolate cake. And then I become somebody who likes chocolate cake and I start to become identified with that. And so, and then, this feeds back to the next time we see some cake and our brain says, I like cake and I eat cake. And we get stuck in these cycles of these samsaric cycles. Samsara, my understanding, literally means endless wandering, because we're gonna keep eating cake and eating cake and eating cake, looking for happiness. It's going to give us a little bit of a brief relief in terms of us craving cake. But what we see is that craving is what caused the suffering in the first place. So we're creating the itch and then we're scratching it.
Yep.
And then we're wondering why we're stuck when we created it in the first place.
Joseph likes to say drinking seawater, right? Or drinking salt water. I think I've heard him say that before. That really hit me hard. It's like a perfect metaphor. It makes you feel not thirsty for a second, but all you're doing is, exactly.
Yeah, it makes us thirstier. Yeah. And tanha, the Pali word for craving, literally means thirst, if I understand correctly. So that's the basic idea. And these 12 links feed back on to the first, again, there's no real one beginning, but they often start with ignorance, because if you think of ignorance is we're not seeing the world clearly. And so if we don't see clearly, we're going to be constantly looking at the world through these lenses of ignorance, where we're like, oh, that water looks good, I'm going to drink more. And then I get thirstier. And then I can't see that I'm creating my own thirst. So that's dependent origination. Apologies to the Buddhist scholars that are cringing right now at my description of it. But also, if you look at that, that's also the very same concept as what drives every single habit in modern day psychology. So in modern day psychology, they describe this as positive and negative reinforcement, which is, this reinforcement learning process is basically, you can break it down to three simple elements: a trigger, a behavior, and a result. So if we, and these two converge, doesn't matter how simply you explain it, it's still the same thing. If we see the cake, eat the cake, And then if we get this dopamine hit that says to our brain, hey, there are a bunch of calories in there, you should do that again, that feeds back so that the next time we see cake, we eat it. We also learn to eat when we're not hungry. I'm just using eating as an example. If we're, stressed out, and we learn if we eat cake that it temporarily distracts us from the stress, then we learn, oh, when I'm stressed, I should eat cake. Voila, stress eating. Even anxiety. I didn't even know this. I didn't learn this in medical school, but it turns out that anxiety can even be driven as a habit. So any sense of self, anything that we identify with, becomes a source of suffering. And if we can't see clearly that it is the process that we are perpetuating that is causing suffering, we're never going to be able to step out of it. So that I learned that, that was huge for me. And then also I started studying it, saying, okay, when we started creating programs, mindfulness training programs for addictions, I said, let's teach dependent origination in day one. I didn't say, hey guys, now we're going to sit down and go through the 12 links of dependent origination. I just said, with this concept in mind, what are the critical elements here, and what lines up between dependent origination and operant, and operant conditioning or reinforcement learning. And there's a line in the suttas, basically this, where the Buddha says, it wasn't until I explored gratification to its end that knowledge and vision arose. And what he's highlighting there is, if we don't see how unrewarding a behavior is, we're never going to stop it. So I said, that's, let's try this out. Of course, try it out for myself. Plenty of addictions for me to work with. But for example, we did a study with people who are trying to quit smoking. And, I said, okay, try this. Go ahead and smoke. And they're like, doc just told me to smoke. What's going on here? So I got their attention, right? Because I'm being heretical, because everybody's told them to quit smoking. It hasn't worked. If it had worked, they wouldn't need to be in our study. So go ahead and smoke, but pay attention as you do. And they start to realize, they're like, how did I not notice that this is total crap? I had a guy that was smoking 40 years, and we calculated roughly how many times he'd reinforce this loop. It was like 293,000 times that he'd reinforce it. Literally, like I'm not exaggerating. If he'd smoked one pack a day for 40 years. And he comes back and he says, how did I not notice that this is disgusting? Because he'd formed it as a habit probably when he was about 13, which is the average age that most of the folks in our study start smoking, because the reward of being cool or rebellious or whatever is more rewarding than the nasty taste of a cigarette. And then we get addicted to the nicotine. And so we get below, we start to create that itch with the nicotine deficit, and our brain says, hey, make that itch go away. So we smoke. And we're just doing this, trying to get back to baseline when we've created that hole, and we keep digging ourselves into it. So long story short, tested out that hypothesis, exploring gratification to its end. And lo and behold, we see this with smoking. We got 5 times the quit rates of gold standard treatment for smoking cessation. We tested this in our Eat Right Now app, where we have people pay attention as they overeat. And it only took them 10 to 15 times of overeating for that reward value to drop below 0. So in modern day neuroscience terms, we can confirm what the Buddha was talking about in terms of exploring gratification to its end. We become disenchanted with these old behaviors when we see very, very clearly that they're not serving us.
Can I ask you a question about that? So this is something that came up for me also when I was reading your really fantastic book, Unwinding Anxiety, which I found enormously helpful as an anxiety prone person myself. Applying this habit loop model and understanding to anxiety. So what you said was, if I remember right just now, was you said that the reward of sort of being cool, maybe also I would guess the sort of initial nicotine rush, all of those things are more rewarding than the grossness is gross, right? So you get the positive reinforcement. My question is, if that's true, then isn't it a net positive in terms of the feedback? And how does being more mindful, wouldn't you also be more mindful of the dopamine rush and all these positive things? Like, in other words, how do you shift through mindfulness this net the net reward in service of doing it to the net feedback in service of this is gross not doing it.
Yeah. So let's clarify a couple of things. One is generally when we're older than a teenager. So I'll just speak for myself. As a teenager, I did all sorts of stupid things to try to impress my friends.
Yeah.
And anytime beyond teenage years, you don't walk up to somebody and be like, look how cool I am, I'm smoking. They're like, you idiot, you're going to get lung cancer, and that smells like crap. Get away from me, So there's no positive reinforcement after the trials of our teenage years. Let's put it that way.
Touche.
And the other piece there that it's really important to point out is dopamine is not about happiness. This is in yet another internet meme where people associate, there are all these popular writings about dopamine being a happiness molecule. It is not, absolutely not. There's no evidence for it. What dopamine is set up to do is to two main things. One is to help us learn something when there's something new. So ancient ancestors out on the savannah had to find food, didn't have refrigerators. None of our memory banks are large enough to just be constantly remembering everything. So we'd have to be selective in what we remember. So the way our brains deal with this is that when we find a new food source, there's this moment of surprise. Oh, wow, that's good food. And that surprise is dopamine spritzing in our brain saying, remember this. So dopamine is about laying down a context-dependent memory, meaning I'm going to remember what this context is, right? Whether it's positive reinforcement, like here's food source, or negative reinforcement. Oh, there's some danger. I got to run away from that. Don't go back there. The other main function of dopamine is to get us off our butts to go do that thing again. So our brains shift from, like, if we go back to the same food source, it's no longer surprising that it's there because it's there. So we don't get that same surprise hit because our brain is saving that dopamine to learn something else new. And what it's going to do instead is it's going to say, when we're hungry, our stomach's going to rumble, and it's going to reignite that memory that says, hey, remember the food's over there. And then dopamine fires that says, makes us itchy, antsy, urgy. And it says, go do this, go do this. Did you hear any pleasantness in any of that? No, there's no pleasantness. Dopamine's not about pleasant. And I can, talk to any of my patients who are addicted to any substance. Cocaine makes people paranoid and restless. Cravings are not pleasant at all. All of these things are just meant for survival, not about happiness.
Or think of how you feel when you're scrolling your Facebook feed or your Instagram feed or something, right? Yeah. Like it's constant dopamine, but no one really likes
that's
doing
right.
that.
Right. It's not like, oh, I'm so happy as a zombie scrolling. Yeah. So I think that's really important because you can find a gazillion secondary resources, not any primary research, suggesting that dopamine is a happiness molecule, but it's just a misconception where they're not understanding the science.
So you'd say you would characterize it, to be overly reductive of what you just said, you'd characterize it as essentially a craving molecule.
Yes, if I don't like to, because our brain's much more complex than that.
Of course. That is super.
That is more correct than a pleasantness molecule. Let's just say it's associated with craving.
Got it. Interesting. So you have it sounds like you've been able to take this contemplative wisdom and figure out how to apply it to these very current, really age-old problems that weren't always associated with them, things like substance addictions and so forth. Is it possible to, maybe this is circular since it came from the contemplative wisdom in the first place in a sense, but since you've now studied it in ways that perhaps the great sages of the past didn't even have the means or technology to do you have insights based on this understanding that we as practitioners can apply for the sake of our practice?
I would say I've not gained any insight that wasn't already spoken of, but it helped clarify things for me. I think Goenka, the meditation master from Burma, in India, who he was Indian, who I think studied with a Burmese master, Uba Khen. He described the Buddha as a super scientist, and I concur in the sense that everything that we're studying today is basically just testing the hypotheses that were put forward by the Buddha before paper was even invented. And everything he has said has helped refine and clarify and simplify my research. So the part about focusing on craving and, ending craving and reward value, all of that's based on this gratification stuff. The other piece that I would say was very clarifying for me was around, I spent 10 years beating my head against the proverbial meditation while trying to force meditation. And if you look at things like the factors of awakening, they really talk about interest and curiosity as a way to develop concentration rather than force. And, the Western way is force it, just do it, right? Grate your teeth and just do it. Our brains don't really work that way. And so that my neuroscience work has also helped clarify that. We've done a bunch of neuroimaging work looking at, there's a fancy term called neurophenomenology, where we can basically link subjective experience with brain activity by giving people feedback from their brains in real time as they're meditating. So we can use fMRI, we can use source estimated EEG. It's different than like the commercially available headsets. Those I would not pay money for.
Yeah,
those.
you're not using a Muse headset in your research in the lab.
Let's just say we have several Muse headsets that that are sitting on the shelf. I'll leave it at that.
They look cool. There's that.
Yeah, so here what we've found is that, and I think the simplest way to put this is there are networks of brain activity that are involved in self-reference and craving and all this stuff called the default mode network, and it gets activated with everything from any substance that somebody craves tends to activate the default mode network, especially the posterior cingulate cortex, as does perseveration when we're thinking about ourselves, and especially when we're worrying about the future. The more we worry, the more it gets activated. What we've found over and over is that meditation deactivates that network. And specifically, it's about, we can line these two up, where it's about getting caught up in experience. When we get caught up in a craving, clinging, when we get caught up in worrying, when we're, worried about the future, that activates this network. And anything like curiosity, kindness, other types of absorptive concentrations, when we're not forcing ourselves to pay attention to an object, but simply being curious about it, that deactivates this network. So what that has said to us is really highlighted the critical function of the attitudinal quality of the mind, where I think of it as like curiosity. Curiosity conquers all, in the sense that it's not even conquering in the way that we think of like going in and beating down the doors and trying to conquer somebody. It's really about, this open-handed, really open. And that's what this is all about, is opening. And so if you think of anything that causes a contraction, that contraction says, here I am, and here's the rest of the world outside of me. And the more we let go and open up, the harder it is to really get a sense of where we are and where the rest of the world begins. And then we move into very quickly into this non-dual realm, whether you call it flow, Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi talks about flow being selfless, or any non-dual tradition, or even Buddhism, where this non-self, where we're having a direct experience, a direct non-self experience, that's about the expansion. So what I would say I've learned is it's really simplified my own practice for sure, which is around just paying attention to contraction versus expansion and how painful they are. Which one feels more painful? We've done the research, but I'm sure everybody can do their own N of 1 experiment right now. What feels better, right? It's a no-brainer. To our brains, it's a no-brainer.
Yeah.
In our experience, it's a no-brainer, right? So if you want, specifics, we've looked at frustration, anger, things like that. They all, people report those as contracting, and they are less rewarding than kindness, curiosity, and connection. And in fact, one fun fact, when we did a study with several hundred non-meditators we had people rate, all these different things and how desirable they were. And craving, so it was very clear, frustration felt closed, curiosity felt open, for example. But craving, half the participants said it felt closed and half said it felt open. And I said, well, that's interesting. My hypothesis was that they're focusing on the object of craving, not the craving itself. So we repeated the experiment with experienced meditators. 100% of them said it felt closed. And so that suggests that if we can't pay careful attention to craving itself, which often we don't do unless we're training ourselves to do it, we don't actually see that craving itself is that contracted, closed quality of experience that doesn't actually feel very good.
Yeah, that's fascinating to me, and it totally lines up, with my intuitions, because it sounds like that half of the non-meditators was making exactly the mistake that we make in every moment when we indulge in our cravings. We're getting sort of tricked that we're going to like this, right? Yeah. And the craving points us at the promised gratification. It points us at the promised happiness that's supposed to be delivered, and it's a sleight of hand, right? It's saying, don't look at me, look at how good this cake's going to be. Don't look at the craving, which is pain, which is dukkha. And yeah, that like I think your hypothesis, not that you need me to validate it, is eminently sensible. That like those people are getting tricked in the same way that we're always getting tricked by craving. That is fascinating, and I really think it's interesting how the research corroborates. You and I talked a little bit before, and you talked about how the research is more corroborative, or than that. Like it hasn't transformed the way we meditate. It has, as you said, it sort of helped clarify and illuminate and shed interesting new light on these very ancient insights. But your point that even based on the brain research and what you see, it helps reinforce the idea that, for instance, concentration is not deepened effectively through that sort of forceful, gripping activity. That is, I think, a useful insight. I know teachers have been saying that for a long time, but other teachers have said other things, right? And so it's actually kind of interesting to have the referee of neuroscience come in and say, well, here's what the research suggests is here's what's happening in the brain when you're contractive versus expansive. And here's what that might say about the most effective way to settle your mind and shut down the default mode network, or quiet it at least.
Yeah. Factors of awakening are really focusing in on reward-based learning. So if you look at some factors of awakening, concentration comes at position number 6. And they're described, like in Anapanasati Sutta, as this causal chain of events. If you start by mindfulness, being aware and being curious, it's like rubbing those two sticks together, and you create this heat of energy, virya, like this courageous energy. If you're curious about something, you're going to naturally, pay attention to it. Mm-hmm. And then, that energy arises, and then, it just kind of goes down this line. And you naturally develop concentration in a completely effortless manner. Totally different than the way I'd been practicing. And I think a lot of the way that the people fall into a trap of, they have an idea that they just have to pay attention to their breath or whatever. And then, all great things will happen. Well, what they're doing is just perpetuating the habit of efforting.
Yep. Yep. And I'm reminded here of, 2 things that I've heard different teachers say. So one is this wonderful teacher, Marcia Rose, who I think you know. And she pointed out to me, when we engage in sort of striving activity in meditation, right? That sort of efforting that you're talking about, where you're trying to use force, even maybe in spite of yourself, even if you know that's not the right way to practice, but you kind of can't help it because it's such an old habit. Her instruction was very simple and very powerful, which was, just look and notice that it's dukkha. Notice that the striving is painful. And it's a very Judd Brewery piece of advice, right? Like, look at the reward, look at the feedback loop of that. And I found that incredibly helpful, more than trying to convince myself that striving was unhelpful or trying to talk to myself about all the reasons it was bad. Just look for the little fleck of suffering every time you do that.
And you're highlighting something. If you look at the the foundation of mindfulness, I don't know if they're taught in this order on purpose, but the first foundation is the body. And I think of this as the feeling body is much stronger than the thinking brain, right? And so that's where the money is. When it comes to changing a habit, this is how I do this in my clinic and in our research, you've got to you only develop wisdom through experience, and experience is felt in the body, body, mind. They're not really separate. We can't convince ourselves not to do something.
Yeah.
If we could, life would be much easier, but that's not how it works. It's really the feeling body. So like you're pointing out, can't convince ourselves that striving is dukkha. We have to really experience it. And the way to experience it is get curious. Oh, what does striving actually feel like? Oh, and how does it feel compared to non-striving? So we give our brain that choice where it can pick. And again, our brains are going to always pick what's more rewarding. Non-striving feels more rewarding than striving.
Yep. And absolutely. And you talk about that in your book. You get a little in Unwinding Anxiety, which again, I'm going to plug. It's just such a good book. You talk about how the part of our brains responsible for sort of rational thought and reasoning, much newer, and in a sense, sort of thinner and weaker than the deep old structures that are responsible for these more visceral feelings. And so, if you're going to choose which one of those you're going to send into battle on your behalf, choose the very muscular old structures that correspond more to these deep feelings that we can feel in our bodies. I thought that was really interesting. And this connects to the second teacher that I was thinking of was Ajahn Ajahn Brahm, who he talks about how, the easiest way, or one of the easiest ways to let go of sort of distracting thoughts when you're doing concentration practice, samadhi or samatha practice, is to just see that it's a burden. In other words, don't talk yourself out of it. He says it's a burden. It's like you're carrying all this luggage. You've been carrying it your whole life, and you've never looked and noticed that you've got this thing strapped to your back. You've got this luggage in your hands. Just notice and put it down, and you'll see how much better it feels. Again, mindfulness-driven, feedback-based, reward-based learning.
Yeah. And here, not to split hairs, but we can even think of this as putting something down, but I think they use metaphors of the hot coal.
Totally. Yep.
So if we're holding a hot coal, all we have to do is pay attention and see that it's burning our hand. And we naturally do this. We don't even have to put it down because it's already out of our hand before we're consciously aware of it.
Yeah.
That's how powerful noticing is. Yeah.
Right. Our only job is to recognize that this sucks, basically. And then the rest sort of does itself.
So that actually simplifies everything from my addiction practice, my outpatient clinic, to my research, to my own personal practice. It all distills to one thing, which is just bringing curious awareness to everything, and have that compass set up where you can see, well, an awareness is going to do this as long as our compass is oriented. When we're seeing very clearly the contraction feels unpleasant and expansion feels pleasant, that compass is already set up for us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So all we need is a curious awareness. That will help develop ethical conduct on its own, because we see how painful it is to be a jerk. That will develop concentration, like you're talking about, this mental development. All of it emerges from that simple thing, curious awareness.
Yeah, and what a beautiful unification of, for instance, not to reduce it just to this, because as you said, with sila, ethical conduct, all these things, but what a beautiful unity of mindfulness and concentration, or vipassana and samatha, which are so often treated as, in some circles, as a sort of never the twain shall meet, separate practices. And your whole point right now sounds to me like, no, it's through mindfulness that concentration naturally deepens, which I think is, it's just a beautiful sort of grand unifying theory of contemplative practice.
Well, and I'll even say, just to double click on the concentration piece. When I was doing, a couple of years ago, I was doing some really focusing in on concentration practices. And as I was trying to develop that, was just noticing how painful it was to get caught up there was anger that was coming up with a colleague at work.
Mhm.
And I was noticing how that was getting in the way of concentration, even though I was on a month-long retreat, colleague nowhere in sight,
Yeah.
yet it was getting in the way. And so I could see how painful that was. And then I could also see how much more just the joy of concentration was, where they say 3 levels higher, it's like, I don't remember what the hierarchy is, but the pleasantness that comes with certain levels of deep concentration is so much more pleasant than the everyday where they just kind of sense pleasures. It's also a no-brainer.
Yeah. I could do this all day. Like this is, and honestly, this is benefiting. This is going to benefit my practice because this is clarifying things that have been stewing in the back of my head. I've been reviewing, those points by Ajahn Brahm, by Marcia, but this is sort of tying it together in a way that is really clarifying for me. So just selfishly, thank you for what this will do for my own practice. But I don't want to keep you all to myself. Is it okay if we open it up to Q&A with the group?
Sure.
Excellent.
Sure.
All right. So Eris, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, but it's like I have a kind of perspective which disagrees with some of the points that Judson said.
As long as there's a question there, go for it.
My perspective on craving is that, the brain goes to pleasure and avoids pain, right? So the craving, like, we need some kind of chemical, and after that chemical, there needs to be some pleasure, right? But pleasure isn't necessarily happiness. My question is that why do we put craving is the energy of desire, is the energy of hunger at the end of the day, is the energy of the warrior and the king. So it's this bad thing where we just suppress our desire, let go of all of our control, and you just become our lover and our magician. But there's no energy of change in there, right? So is that your perspective to suppress our energy of change, or be more calm all of the day? Or are you saying that it should be like, more progressive in a sense? What is your idea of happiness in this sense?
Yeah. So here, it's a really good question. And I probably didn't clarify what I was saying very much, so I'll do that. This isn't to say that craving is bad and should be suppressed or gotten rid of. It's about seeing when we get caught up in craving, that it can actually lead and perpetuate a cycle of suffering. So like you're saying, if we're hungry and we have an urge to get some food, there's not suffering in that per se. It just might say, hey, go get some food. If we are identified with that craving, or we're caught up in a cycle of craving where we're eating food as a way to distract ourselves from stress, it's going to keep us distracted, but it's not actually going to help us get at that root cause of the stress itself. So this isn't to say that there's a problem with craving. It's a natural, physiologic, built-in mechanism. It's when we start getting lost in the identification with, like, oh, I am this, I am that. And what we can explore is what that caught upness feels like. So we can have a craving and be totally open to the craving. Oh, here's a craving. And the craving can be giving us information, saying, hey, go get some food. And if we can pay attention, we can act on it. Oh, okay, I'll go get some. If I'm hungry, might be helpful to get some food so I don't pass out or whatever. Yet if I'm totally identified or not aware that it is a craving, then I can be stuck in kind of acting it out habitually or mindlessly. And that, and it's not to say if we act something out habitually, it's a problem. We just need to pay attention to see if it is a problem. So I think if you think of a habit, most of the habits we do every day are helpful. And those have been formed through this dopaminergic mechanism. Yet some of the habits probably aren't serving us very well. So for example, if I'm attached to a particular idea or a view, and somebody challenges my view and I say, no, but my view is right, that's going to cause suffering, at least for me, and probably for the person I'm having a conversation with, because they're seeing that I'm not open to having a conversation. If instead I approach that with curiosity, like, oh, here's a view, as compared to that's my view, I'm going to defend it at all costs, that's a very different story. So I don't know if that answers your question or not, or gives something to explore. This is all about really exploring, like, is this true? The Buddha said, don't believe me. And I would say the same thing. Don't believe what I say, but hopefully I'm not muddling the conversation, but can give some things to focus on. And so what I would say is, see how much contraction there is when we're caught up in a craving, or you can even explore this yourself. See if there is suffering in that contraction. And then also see if there's a way out of that suffering through just being with that craving itself.
Yeah, but yes, thank you.
Thanks a
thanks
lot,
for-
Aris. And
thanks for
thank
the
you,
question.
Judd. Really appreciate that. So I have a question here that I have been sent to ask. It's from our friend Ben. He said I could name him. Do you have any suggestions for how to respond wisely to technology that is designed to addict us? Social media sites do it, of course, but more and more these days, even apps that should be mundane are insidiously addictive due to tech companies' profit motive to hog our attention. What are some ways we can sustainably cut off that loop?
Yeah, we don't have to cut anything off. The nice thing is that if we can see very, very clearly what we're getting from them, we can separate out what's helpful and what's harmful. So my phone, these weapons of mass distraction, as Cornel West puts it, we are only subject to them when they have us under their spell. So my phone's very helpful for navigating the very winding streets of Boston, for example. It's not so helpful if I'm mindlessly scrolling and caught up in some Twitter fight or something like that. So if I can see what's helpful, navigation, I'm going to keep doing that. And if I can see what's harmful, I just spent 30 minutes, yelling at somebody on Twitter and having my blood pressure go up to the benefit of no one. If I can see that, then I'm going to become disenchanted. And, I have a Twitter account. When I first got on Twitter, I was like, oh, what's this? And it was very easy to watch how easy it would be to get caught up in it. And by paying attention, I could see, wow, this is a total waste of time. Like, it's helpful. Like, I just went on Twitter yesterday and I saw a very interesting thread around sense of time from a bunch of neuroscience researchers. So I actually read that thread and learned a ton in a very efficient manner, and could even add to that thread. I was like, oh, our meditation research shows this. Helpful, same Twitter, but as compared to what do I, if I'm mindlessly scrolling, not helpful. And all of that depends on awareness. So the technology is going to get more and more addictive. Everybody's going to do everything they can. That doesn't matter. They're going to do it anyway. We can't single-handedly stop it. But what we can do is learn how our minds work and work with our minds. And then we've developed that mental immunization against it. And we can work with any social media virus that comes our way.
Thank you for that, Judd. Yeah, I agree. I sometimes refer to mindfulness practice with respect to technology as attentional self-defense. And it's something that I think we're going to need to all train in a little bit.
Yeah. And here, I'm just going to harp on the words here. I think of it Aikido, right? For those familiar with Aikido, is you use the energy as compared to fight against it. And this is really a critical aspect here. It's about, okay, here's the energy of the mind. Can I work with it? Can I transform that in a way that's beneficial for all? Like, oh, here's social media. What can I learn from this? As compared to, oh no, here's social media. I need to fight against it. So even how we practice self-defense is critical. And I'm sure you're talking about the Aikido type, but I just want to clarify that for anybody that might be curious.
No, I think that's an important distinction, and it's well put. So thanks for that. I have another one that was sent for me to read, and it says, please talk about craving anxiety. I find myself addicted to numerous dramas in my life, and I struggle with not craving the energy created by those dramas.
Yeah, we saw this, regardless of where somebody is on the political end of the spectrum. If they lived in the US after the 2016 election, there's a huge amount of uncertainty when Trump took presidency, because he was, his nature seems to be to do things that are unpredictable. And whether somebody was a Republican or a Democrat, it drove everybody mad because they didn't know, mad in a like, woohoo, or oh no, like everybody was checking to see what he was going to do next. And then when Biden got elected, he's not quite as exciting as Trump. And so people are like, oh, and they're all coming down from the craziness of and again, not a judgment, like just the heightened energy, let's say, of the Trump years, where they're like, wow, life is so boring, and then they're like, where's the excitement? Because our brains, they're just used to that level of uncertainty, because our survival brains are saying danger, 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 and then we're like, oh, is there no danger here? There should be some danger here, because we're used to we're gotten comfortable with the discomfort of uncertainty. And then when it goes away, it reveals that we've formed a habit around it. And so, it takes a while for that non-drama to become the new norm. So I don't know if that gets directly at it, but what I would say is, when anxiety is a habit and we're identified with it, when we worry, when that becomes who we are, when we're not worried, we start worrying why we're not worried. And I've had patients like this I had a guy who I actually write about him in my Unwinding Anxiety book, who'd had generalized anxiety for 30 years. And when he started to have extended moments of calm, I remember him coming in my office one day saying, I'm getting anxious that I'm not anxious. And it was just that our brains don't like change. And so when change had happened, he had to get used to the new normal. And that change process was signaling, hey, there might be danger here. And he just had to look around and say, nope, no danger. In fact, calm's pretty good. Yeah. And then he's like, wow, I'd prefer calm. And then, he's off to the races from there. So often we can be addicted to that feeling of worry because it's normal, it's comfortable, because it is familiar. And so any change is going to engender our brain to wake up and say, oh, is there danger? And that's when we have to really pay attention. Is there danger here? Do something if there is. And if there isn't, say, oh, it's change. Yeah. And then get used to that.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Thank you, Jed. And it sounds like, honestly, it sounds like we haven't really touched on the teachings of impermanence necessarily in the Buddhist canon, but it sounds like there's a lot to be gleaned from that dimension of the teachings here as well, when it comes to the suffering or the fear that comes from change.
Yeah. In a nutshell, the only unchanging thing is change itself. I'm sure people have heard that saying. And the idea is, if we can lean into and see all change as an opportunity to learn and grow, we're moving into our growth zone as compared to running away, either being in our panic zone or our comfort zone. If that growth zone can become our new comfort zone, then there are many fewer problems, because we can lean into uncertainty and any obstacle becomes the way. And that's what impermanence is all about. Oh, fear of death. Okay, well, there's pain. Can I lean into that and explore it? Right.
Yeah. Uncertain impermanence is a gateway to freedom also, right? It means that anything's possible, and that and newness is constantly arising. Well, thanks, Judd. That was really helpful and wonderful. So, Rick, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, sounds good. Thanks, John. Thanks, Judd. So my question is really quite related to what we were just talking about. I feel like I am a person who experiences anxiety and is currently has not yet reached the problem of having extended periods without anxiety. It happens, but I don't feel like that's my main obstacle. And through therapy, meditation, it seems to be the case that the anxiety I experience arises from a fundamental feeling of not being safe, regardless of external circumstances. It can be a totally safe situation, feels unsafe, and that's kind of repressed and mostly felt as tension in the body. So with all that said, what does your research or your personal experience suggest for getting at that feeling of not being safe when you are?
So if you had to pick when you pay attention to the tension in your body, is there a mental reaction of, I'm going to give you two choices, oh no, here it is, or oh, here it is?
I think more of, oh, here it is. I think I spend a lot of time not noticing it. I usually notice it when I'm actively meditating, and then I have a mindful attitude toward it.
Yeah. So when you have that mindful attitude, and let's forget the word mindfulness because it's a concept. So getting at your concrete, direct experience, what happens when you notice the tension and you're curious about it as compared to resisting it?
I don't have a prepared answer.
No, and I'm asking for you to feel into your experience if you can recall a time. And if not, there's something to explore.
Maybe I feel like I usually can't sustain the attention for long. And so I just kind of observe the tension, and there's a bit of relaxation that comes a little bit.
Yeah. And it doesn't matter how long you sustain the attention, right? It's just in that moment so I think of it this way, and our research backs this up, is when, the idea of what we resist persists, and so our habitual reaction often is there's tension, we resist it, right? Because it's just, that's unpleasant. Let me kind of brace myself or kind of wall myself off from it. That's what our survival brain is doing, especially if it's like learned, oh, this could be dangerous. So here, what we can do is to kind of not do anything, but just get curious, like, oh, instead of going, oh, we can notice the oh and bring in a oh, like, oh, there's oh, if that makes sense, right? And so in that moment where we're noticing the tension or we're noticing resistance or we're noticing anything, we're just flooding it with curiosity, like, oh, what does that feel like? Oh, where is it? Is it on the right side, left side, front, back? Oh, what does it feel? Is it moving? And that curiosity is really all we need, because even in that moment, it feels less painful to be curious than it is to resist, than it does. I'll put that as a hypothesis that you can test, you can explore. Which feels less painful, to be curious in that moment or to be contracted around or bracing against the object, even just habitually, right? It's not like you're consciously trying to brace. It's a habitual bracing. I would guess it's a habitual bracing. Does that make sense?
It does. It does make sense. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's really just about checking the mental tone of voice. Oh, and oh, there's oh. That's it. Like I would go as far as saying that's the whole of the practice. It probably sounds heretical because the polycanon's pretty thick, but if you really look at the through line, it's about curious awareness, And the Buddha taught it a gazillion different ways based on different circumstances, based on what somebody needed to hear at the time.
Thank you.
Sure. And have fun exploring that, because curiosity is not about the grit, oh, I got to do this. Oh, what can I learn?
Yeah, I'll do my best. Thank you.
All right.
Thanks, Rick. And thank you, Judd. Mary, would you like to ask your question?
So thanks. I think I could ask you a lot of questions. Fascinating. And I've really appreciated everyone else's questions as well. I'm kind of having a little synchronicity here, so I just want to bring it up. I do a loving kindness practice every day, and it's based on a book called Aging as a Spiritual Practice. Anyway, it's sort of as I age, may I, la la la. And I recently added in, may I have experiences instead of like, may I be safe, may I be healthy, you know, because it's a little different when you're 68, okay? You know, it's a little different. So one of the things was, may I accept joy and awareness, and or joy and sadness. And I said, that's too narrow, right? And so I just said, you know, may I accept joy and awareness, experiences, emotions with equanimity and curiosity. So I think my question for you is, I'm sorry, I have not read your books, okay?
That's okay.
And, you know, what do you think about that idea? What do you think about actually stating the intention of curiosity as part of your loving kindness practice?
Yeah. Well, it sounds like it's been fruitful already. And so I would just affirm, you know, and the stating things can be different for different people. So I would just say, for me, even just the stating it can help kind of bring it to mind. And the may I like the way you phrase that, or, you know, it's like, as compared to I've got to, I must, you know, the Western way, may I, you know, it's like this open-handed, oh. And the other thing I would add there is, if you look, going back to the 7 factors of awakening, the equanimity is number 7. It comes as a causal chain that starts with awareness and curiosity. And so if we're curious, we're not resisting things. And so that equanimity naturally develops. And so I would say the two are causally connected in that sense. To give a concrete example, let's go back to the one around attachment to views. You know, if somebody says, oh, you know, what you're saying is crap or whatever, if I resist that and say no, and I start defending it, I'm not actually open and curious to what they have to say. And I'm certainly not equanimous, right? So it's like I'm starting to build a wall, whereas curiosity helps me see I don't need to build a wall. I might even learn something. It's like, oh, you know, tell me more. And so the tell me more is very different than don't talk to me because I have a fixed view. And we can see how, just opens us. So we melt. And when there is no self, I think of those, what are those Bobo dolls? You remember the blow up dolls that have a little sand in the bottom and you kind of push on them and they pop back up. I had one of the, as a kid, you know, you push on the doll and it goes down and then it comes back up. If there is no, you know, it's like if there's no Bobo doll there, the energy comes and there's nothing to get pushed over. If we're not there in terms of taking something personally, I think of that as pretty strong equanimity. We're open to all ideas because it's not about us being there to defend ourselves. Does that make sense? So the curiosity I see very much feeds and supports and creates the conditions for equanimity to arise. And then we see how pleasant equanimity is as compared to defensiveness. And then we're like, wow, I want more of that. You know? And then it just starts to feed itself. It's like, oh boy, my ego is a pain in the ass.
Oh, thank you. And, you know, on the felt sense of the body, I'm a fairly kinesthetic person. So I just want to throw in quickly, as you were talking, my body just kind of melted. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Mary. Thanks, Judd. Eve, do you want to ask your question?
Sure. Thanks, John. Judd, I really appreciate you being here. And I'm learning a lot when you're answering other people's questions. And it's kind of like keeps affecting my own question. But the idea of the contraction and expansion and like noting noting when one feels better, and then the curiosity as you're like cultivating your inner voice to, or conditioning to your inner voice to respond in a curious way to yourself, instead of defensive. And I find that fascinating, because my question was like, I tend to have emotional habits that are contracting as opposed to expansive. But I think what you're talking about with bringing in the curiosity constantly as like a condition, almost a self-conditioning type of experience, is like because I know that the startle reflex or surprise is like a reset emotion. So I'm wondering if you're kind of using it in that way to like break patterns. Every time you're curious, you're surprised. Oh, this is what's coming up right now. It's like a way of like breaking a pattern. So that way, and it shifts your emotional habits too, which like changes your relationship to yourself and your body, and like gives you freedom for new behaviors. So I'm just wondering about that.
Yeah, no, I hadn't thought about that, but it makes complete sense to me. It's like, if we're stuck, if we're in a hole and then we hear a noise, we're like, oh, we stick our head out of the hole. Like, oh, what's that? And then we're out of the hole. So if I'm understanding what you're saying, yeah, I think that's a really nice way of putting it, and helps us say, oh, I'm in a hole. Do I really want to be here?
Yeah, I guess if you had any more thoughts or advice about how to continue to come to a more open place, as opposed to being contracted or clinging to old habits.
The nice thing here is that awareness works for all of these. So in that sense, the curiosity, as you pointed out, will become self-reinforcing. And it's just a matter of noticing what it feels like when we are curious, or even afterwards, so we can reflect on something that we do after we do it and still learn from it if we can feel into what it felt like. So if I can, remember, I don't know, I was gonna say, I remember last time I was curious, but right now I'm feeling it, so it's not a good example. If I can remember last time I did something like eat a certain type of food, and I can feel what it felt like, or an amount of food, I can really feel like, oh, was that a was that too much, too little, whatever. I'm just feeling back into dinner that I ate tonight. And it was like, okay, that was the right amount. And that helps me learn for the next time I'm going to have dinner, like, oh, last time that was the right amount, because I can feel into the results of that. With curiosity, we can just feel into the last time we were curious. And the nice thing about this is you can just get curious, like, what was it like the last time I was curious? And then we're already curious. So the curiosity is an easy one, or when we're not curious, we're like, what's it feel like not to be curious? And then we're curious. So curiosity is easy. The other thing I would add to that is often I think of curiosity and kindness being close cousins. So there's a softness to the curiosity that we can even name, and it can be fostered when we're just checking to see if we're not being kind to ourselves or to others. And the tone of voice also says it all there. When there's a kind tone of voice, inner or out or spoken, and then there's one that's not so kind. And we can just see which one feels better. When harsh doesn't feel good, kindness feels good. And it's self-perpetuating when we notice, oh, what was it like when somebody was kind to me? It feels pretty good. And then that drives kindness as a habit. And so, I would say it's these two cousins going arm in arm, kindness and curiosity, that just build on each other. And so we can tap into either of them at any time. And we can also, if we can't feel like we can tap into them, we can go, oh, why can't I tap into this? And then we're curious. But we can also check to see, are we in a habit of judgment or harshness, which can be tamping down the curiosity and can be tamping down the kindness. So does that kind of get at what you're pointing out?
Yeah, that's extremely helpful. Because I noticed when you were like doing the demonstrations of the curious voice that there was a lack of judgment that was really freeing. But what you're saying about kindness and curiosity going together being companions, that is like very helpful for me, because I'm a very curious person, but it tends to be not kind. Sometimes it's just like doom, especially to myself. So this will be a really good softening agent. So
Great.
thank
I
you
like
so
that.
much.
Sure. Softening agent. That's great.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Eve. Oh, we always love it when, and thank you, Judd. We always love it when a cat makes an appearance.
Samson likes the Zoom bomb for sure.
Yeah, that's always fun. Sean, who hangs out with us sometimes, has a really wonderful cat who really loves the spotlight. So we usually get some guest appearances. All right, I have a question that was sent to me to read. You touched on the characteristic of non-self / anatta earlier in the conversation. Is there support in neuroscientific research for non-self?
Well, I would say there isn't a lot of support for self. So, the absence of evidence isn't evidence for absence yet. Nobody has quite nailed the self piece yet. So, someone's like, this is self and we've nailed it. That might say something, but people have been looking for a long time and pretty hard and nobody's found it yet. So, I would say that's, again, absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence, but it's supportive. I'll put it that way.
Yeah, that's helpful. And it's very hard to prove the absence of something, right? Can you even prove the absence of something? You can just fail to find it over and over, right?
Yeah, right.
Awesome. Let's see. Oh, Stephen, do you want to ask your question? And thanks for that, Judd. Go ahead, Stephen.
Yeah. Okay. Hi, Judd. Thanks for answering all these questions for us. And it's definitely been an enlightening evening. My question is on any kind of fMRI neural correlates that you've noticed when people transition from being identified to having a moment of curious awareness. Like, is there kind of like, it goes from like a single node of activity to like a multi-node of activity, almost like other areas of the brain are lighting up such that there's like this contrasting mechanism happening? Or if not that, what are the kind of like neural patterns that you see, if there are any?
Yeah, it's a good question. The most consistent neural patterns we've seen are the deactivation of these two hubs of the default mode network. I briefly touched on them earlier. But the posterior cingulate seems to be the one, it's the one that we are putting the spotlight on the most. So we may be missing some things by focusing on that so much. Yet a lot of studies have found that have suggested that it is kind of it's a marker for the experiential sense of self. So that contraction versus expansion versus other hubs of the default mode network, which are more conceptual sense of self. And so it fits with the theory, both neuroscientifically, but also with the Buddhist theory around that sense of self. And also, interestingly, it gets deactivated with psychedelics, for example. So I think of psychedelics as like throwing a hand grenade in your brain and blowing up the sense of self. They're literally mind expanding. And psychedelics are strong enough that they'll actually decouple these two hubs of the default mode network, which are so tightly what's called functionally coupled, as in they're constantly talking, which we imply as talking to each other. And if you look at some of the work by Robin Carhart Harris and others, where they've looked at psychedelics, they actually have looked at the medial prefrontal cortex and have found that it starts expanding its connections, and it's like talking to a bunch of other brain regions, whereas the posterior cingulate's kind of just like shut down, at those times. So what we find, and with curiosity, it gets really shut down. So in terms of a node, I would say the posterior cingulate is a marker that seems to line up pretty consistently between our studies and other people's studies. And also from a theoretical standpoint, it lines up, and also lines up with things like worrying and other psychological states where it gets overactivated. Does that get at your question?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. It was actually our studying of that region using neurofeedback that helped us zoom in on this contraction versus expansion piece, because we'd published a paper where we looked across a bunch of different descriptions and found that seemed to be the commonality, where whether it was activity or activation or deactivation, where people were really reporting like, activation was this contracted, caught up sense. And so we published that in a journal called Frontiers of Neuroscience, I think, back in 2013. I think Katie Garrison is the first author. If you want to look at the specifics of that, I think it was that journal, and it's open access, so anybody can get at it. But it really gets at some of the nuances there, and we did it in a very blinded manner, so we weren't kind of going by some type of bias, and that seems to be what came out. So if that's helpful, you can see all the different categories that converged into this contraction versus expansion piece.
Definitely, that was super helpful. I refrained from adding on a tag-along question of like, where might I find the research, but you answered anyway, so thanks.
Oh, perfect. Yeah.
Thanks, Stephen. Thanks, Judd. So I think I don't see more questions, and we're getting right up to the end point anyway, so I think that's perfect. I do want to ask a similar question about if someone wanted to read more of your research, and if we wanted to read more of your research, and we're not university affiliated ourselves, and so we don't have total access to JSTOR or whatever it is, how do you recommend that we do that? This person who sent me this question said that they read that paying for articles just goes to the archival sites and not to the authors, and that one should contact the authors. So this person wants to know, what's the best way to get their hands, what's the best way to get our grubby little mitts on your research, Judd?
Yeah, so yeah, we generally have to pay to have articles published now, because the journals used to make money through advertisements, and they don't anymore because everything's online. So one nice thing about NIH funded research is that it's required to be open access within a year. So everything, and a lot of these journals, because we have to pay, makes it accessible to people right now. So almost all of my studies are now open access, and I have a Google Scholar profile. So if you just put Judson Brewer in Google Scholar, search for me, there should be, we've got, 90 or so papers published, and you can just look at those. And that should have open access links. If there's one that happens not to have open access for some reason, somebody can just email me. If you want the condensed version of a lot of this, so my first book was called The Craving Mind. I published it in 2017, I think. Kind of summarizes a lot of our neuroimaging work and a lot of this work that we talked about, like with dependent origination. So you can check that out from a library. You don't have to buy it. And then the Unwinding Anxiety talks about a lot of the clinical work in terms of how to, take these practical steps forward. And that summarizes a fair amount of the work that we've done from the clinical side. But most of the papers, if you want to go right to the sources, they should all be available through Google Scholar. And then just email me if they're, if you can't find one. It's just judson.brewer@brown.edu. Perfect.
Great. And for anyone who doesn't know, that's just scholar.google.com. It's a massive, Google administered compendium of basically every research paper that you could ever want to read.
One of the better things that Google has done.
Yeah, one of the legitimately less evil things from the Don't Be Evil company. All right, cool. So, Judd, this was really fantastic. It is not, I don't think it's very often that we can have such a wide-ranging conversation in Q&A, and yet there's such a clear unifying through line. I don't think that's super common. And here I really feel that's the case, where so much, everything that we've talked about, you could essentially hang off of the tree, the central tree of paying close attention to what's good for you and what's bad for you, right? And what feels good and what causes suffering, and the transformative power of that to break these habit loops. And so that I think is extraordinary. And so I'm really grateful for how this all came together and how you were able to sort of it just knitted together really nicely. So I enjoyed this immensely. I'm getting positive feedback from people in the chat. So I think a lot of people enjoyed this. Once again, if you are one of the people who enjoyed this, consider offering dana. Once again, donations given in the spirit of generosity, gratitude toward the teachings. Judd is not asking for dana to be given to himself. He is asking instead that it be directed to Abby's House, an organization helping women and children in Worcester, Massachusetts facing homelessness. Judd, are there any final things that you want to say before we wrap?
Well, I'll just say a plug for Abby's House. It's one of the few organizations that actually supports women. It's solely devoted to women, homeless women, a lot of them who've struggled with addiction, where a lot of organizations shy away from that, and also really work to help them keep their children with them, which is very traumatizing for mothers. So if you are moved to be generous, notice what it feels like. Even in the suttas, there's a 3-part, they talk about being gratified by the teachings and inspired to give, and then, inspired to give it's basically reward-based learning, where there's this urge to give, and then when you give, it feels good, and then there's no buyer's remorse. You don't feel manipulated, and then that's a virtuous cycle for any type of generosity. It doesn't even need to be monetary. So just being kind. Notice how that fits into the same transcendent dependent origination, where we can actually use the same cycle to end the cycle, which is what I'll end on. And all of it, you think of the parsimony, the more I study, the simpler it gets. It's all about kindness and curiosity, rinse and repeat, and just noticing, like you're saying, John, how good they feel.
What a great note to end on. Thank you, Judd. Check out drjudd.com to learn more about Judd Brewer. I cannot say enough good things about his book, Unwinding Anxiety. Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you, Judd. Thank you, everyone who asked a question. Thank you, everyone, for giving your time, giving your attention. And I hope you all have a wonderful night. Bye, everyone.
Take care, everyone.